Alright, this is our second video over the Civil War. We're going to go over some of the early battles. I'm going to get as far as I can. I'm going to try to get through Gettysburg, but I'm limiting myself to 15 minutes because I think any more than 15 minutes of listening to me talk would just be way too much. So, we'll try to limit it. By the way, I was watching some videos earlier today, and I actually watched two of your fellow students. They put together some YouTube videos, Allison Reed and Mike Carpenter. I just checked out their videos. They're awesome. Better than mine, quite honestly. They have the guts to put themselves on camera, and they did a really nice job making these videos. So I'm going to post a link below. So if you go to open this up on YouTube, you can check out the link, check out their videos, check them out. Two very talented girls put together some great videos. Let's go ahead and talk about some battles. All right, the first battle, Bull Run. This is the first major conflict of the Civil War. There have been other little skirmishes, but this is going to be the first major battle that takes place in Virginia. Both the North and the South think it's going to be a fairly easy war. They think it's only going to last maybe 90 days at most. They're both rather confident that they're going to be able to win quite easily. And what we see at Bull Run is these two poorly trained armies clashing. Neither one had a great degree of training. A lot of them were newly formed troops that had not gone through years and years of training like we see in our military today. So it's going to be kind of a rough battle since no one really knows what to expect and no one's all that experienced whatsoever. Okay, one of the things we see is kind of the odd phenomenons about Bull Run is that the people in the North were so confident that their army was going to win that congressmen and senators from Washington, D.C. actually rode out to watch the battle. Something you absolutely would not do today, and you didn't see often in combat. But they were so confident that the North was a superior fighting force that they actually rode out to watch the battle. And it would turn out to be a terrible idea for them. In the chaos of the retreat, many of them get caught up in it, and some were injured. I don't know if there were any actual deaths from that, but some people were injured during the great skedaddle, they called it. And the outside of the battle, we don't go through a lot of gory battle details in these lectures. Just basically talk about the significance of the battle, who won, who lost. At first, it looks like the North is going to win, but the South kind of counterattacks. And at the center of this is this figure, and he'd become a great legend in the Southern military, a guy by the name of Thomas Jackson, and he gains the nickname Stonewall Jackson, and he actually gains it during this battle. While a lot of Confederate forces initially are retreating, his troops stood in the middle and held the line, they say, or would not retreat, would not move back. And one general trying to rally his troops said, "Look, there's Jackson standing like a stone wall." And he got that nickname, and it stuck because his men were always courageous, always fought hard, always obeyed his commands, and he's terribly successful as a Southern general. Excuse me, throughout the course of the war. So the North had kind of underestimated the South. The North ends up losing that battle. The South wins the first major battle of the war, the Battle of Bull Run. The North had underestimated the South. Lincoln's going to kind of, I don't want to say he didn't take it seriously before, but he's really going to try to put an end to this. He calls up for 500,000 volunteers and is going to really try to train a very professional army to try to put an end to this. The next year, kind of early in the next year, spring of the next year, 1862, we see a major battle at a place called Shiloh, which is near the Tennessee River. This is one of the first battles for a general we'll get to know later on, Ulysses S. Grant. And a second general we'll also get to know, William Tecumseh Sherman, both Union generals. They fight at Shiloh. It's a 2-day battle, and it's not terribly important in the big scheme of the entire war. It doesn't necessarily sway the favor towards one side or the other. But the big thing we see at Shiloh are these numbers down here. 24,000 casualties out of 103,000 combatants. It's about 25% casualties in that battle. That shocked the nation, absolutely shocked the nation, and it woke them up that this was going to be a long, long, bloody war. That fourth bullet point also points out that more Americans die in the Battle of Shiloh than all previous American wars combined. That's the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Mexican-American War. So it really opened the country's eyes to the fact that this was not going to be easy, it was not going to be quick, and a lot of young Americans were going to die in this conflict. And the thing about Shiloh is, they thought that was the worst battle we'd ever seen in North American history by far. And there would be 20 to 30 battles that were just as bad as Shiloh. So we just see time after time after time these massive casualties and a lot of death and destruction during the Civil War. So early battles, and we're talking about early battles in the East. That's where the war is really going to be won or lost, in Virginia, near Washington, D.C., near Richmond. There's a lot of fighting throughout the continent, but what happens in the East is really going to be extremely important. We'll talk a little bit about the West later, but early on, basically, the rebels, or the Confederates, were able to get a lot of victories, and it's mostly fueled by the fact that the Union had terribly inept leadership, and the Confederates had great leadership. And we talked about that in the previous video with the strengths and weaknesses, or advantages of the Confederacy. Their great generals really carried them early, and they win a lot of early victories. We won't go into any details on those battles. You can read them up on your own. But generals like Lee and Jackson, and there's other ones we won't talk about, but Jeb Stuart, Nathan Bedford Forrest, and these generals really keep the Confederacy going early on and put them in a position to where they could potentially win the war. Rumors start to circulate that European countries might step in and try to end this war and try to force a peace and try to force a separation of the Union into two countries, the North and the South. So Lincoln is desperately seeking a victory. At the same time, Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, and Robert E. Lee see this as an opportunity that maybe they can force a quick end to the war by attacking northward. So we see this at the Battle of Antietam. Lee invades north for the very first time. It wasn't a great idea necessarily for the Confederacy to invade north too much. They didn't have the resources, they didn't have the population, they didn't have large enough armies. They couldn't fight the entire war in the north. They mostly fought defensively, like we said in their strategies, that they're going to fight a defensive war. But Lee tried to take advantage of the situation, the fact that the Union was reeling after so many losses, and he attacks. So he attacks into Maryland. There he's met by George McClellan, and I didn't talk much about him in the previous slide. McClellan's kind of a villain in the Civil War. He's great at assembling an army and training an army, but in terms of fighting, in terms of battles, he really leaves a lot to be desired. And Lincoln actually fires him twice throughout the Civil War because he's so inept as an actual battle manager. He's not very good. So at Antietam, we see the Confederacy invade the North, and Lee's hoping that a victory would lead to recognition of the Confederacy by Europe. So this battle, and this is a very bloody battle, we'll talk about it, lasts for 12 hours, and it turns out to be the bloodiest day in American history. 23,000 casualties, that's killed, wounded, or missing. 23,000 in one day, or in 12 hours. So you think about that, 2,000 people are killed or wounded, or missing for some reason per hour. And that's a lot. That's a lot going on. The Union actually wins this battle. Now, the battle itself was kind of a stalemate. Neither side really gained any land, and much of an advantage. But what it did do is it stopped Lee's invasion. And the day after the battle, Lee leaves and goes back to the Confederacy with his army, what's left of it. So that was enough for the Union to claim a victory. Just stopping the invasion, that was good enough for them. And Lincoln uses this as a chance to announce his masterstroke, the document that would change the face of the war. That's the Emancipation Proclamation. Emancipation Proclamation went into effect on January 1st, 1863. It declared that slaves should be set free in the Confederacy. Now notice that it says in the Confederacy. It did not actually set any slaves free in the Union. There were slaves in Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland and Delaware, and the Emancipation did not actually set them free. It only set free slaves in the Confederacy. Two things about that. A, like I said, it didn't actually free any slaves in the North, and in the South, we'll put that up there, the South actually just ignores the Emancipation Proclamation. They're going to ignore it. And of course they would. It's a foreign nation trying to tell them what to do, so they're not going to actually follow the Emancipation Proclamation. So does it really free many slaves? No. Okay, but what it does is it changes the purpose of the war and changes the goal of the war. And at the end of the day, the Emancipation Proclamation would change the motive of the war as a motive to end slavery. So now, that kind of pushes back the idea of European intervention. Great Britain and France probably are not going to come to the aid of the Confederacy, since they know that they would indirectly be aiding slavery. Okay, slavery was not used in Great Britain or France at this time, so they're not going to want to aid the Confederacy, knowing that they would be indirectly aiding the extension of slavery. Another thing that we see, because of the Emancipation Proclamations right here, is that we're finally going to allow black soldiers to serve as fighting men in the Union Army and Navy. Now they're going to be in segregated units. They'll be led by white officers, but it'll be all black regiments or all black units. They won't be integrated like in today's military, but it's at least a step in the right direction towards the idea of equality, towards the idea that African Americans were equally able to participate in our military and participate in fighting for freedom of slaves and former slaves. There's a copy of the Emancipation right there. So a couple ideas that come up. First of all, is the Emancipation Proclamation. It made foreign support politically unviable. They were no longer going to really worry about the idea of Europe intervening. The only way that Europe would really intervene is if the slavery decided to give up slavery. Or I'm sorry, if the Confederacy decided to give up slavery, and that's just probably not going to happen. So the question I pose is, was the Emancipation Proclamation used as a strategic weapon by the Union, or did Lincoln truly want to free all the slaves? And in the end, does it really matter? You know, you have to think to yourself, was this simply a political maneuver by Lincoln? Did he do it because he knew that it would hurt the Confederacy and that would help his cause? Or was this really a moral crusade by Lincoln to try to free all the slaves? I think it was a mixture, personally. And in the end of the day, I look at that last question, does it matter? It doesn't, to me. I don't need Lincoln to be the moral guardian of the world. I just need him to do what he did, which is end slavery. I'm not terribly concerned about his motives one way or the other. I like to think of Lincoln as a moral man, but it's not necessarily that easy. Sometimes politicians do things and they look at the politics of things. It's not always about what's morally best. Although you like to think that they are, but it's the political side that they're really concerned about. And Lincoln, to announce the Emancipation Proclamation, really politically made sense for him at that time. And absolutely it was the right thing to do, and we're all happy he did it. But just know that it's not always so easy to say that Lincoln's this morally superior being that understood, the horrors of slavery when many didn't, and wanted to free him because he thought it was the right thing to do. I think he did, but there's more to it. It's more complex than that. Lincoln's a very complex individual. I highly recommend you do some reading on him sometime, because he's a very interesting individual. So let's talk about general ineptitude in the North. That's what I like to call this slide. Throughout the war, what we see, and we've talked about this, we've alluded to this, is that the North just cannot find the right leader. And I have a list here of the generals they went through, from Irvin McDowell to McClellan to John Pope, back to McClellan to Ambrose Burnside. Little side note, the sideburn was actually named after General Burnside. Look him up sometime. He's got some great sideburns. Really interesting. From Burnside to Hooker to George Meade and eventually to Ulysses S. Grant. But the North and the Army of the Potomac, that's the army that they all headed, could not find the right leader. At the same time, the Confederates, they went through too. They went through Joe Johnston, who was actually a really good general in his own right, but he was injured in 1862, and he was succeeded by Robert E. Lee. And that was the only general they had. After Johnston, they went to Lee, and they stuck it out with him until the end of the war. So the difference is, one of the reasons that the Confederacy lasted so long and was so successful for a while and actually threatened to win the war is because they had the stability in their generals that the North just could not find until eventually they get to Grant. Well, that's a little bit further than I thought I would get. Not as far as I wanted to, but I like to talk about the Civil War. So, when we pick up, we'll probably have one, maybe two more videos. So I was shooting for 2 videos. This might end up being 4 at the end of the day. But next video we'll talk about Gettysburg. We'll talk about Grant coming onto the scene as the head of the Army of the Potomac. And hopefully we'll get through the end of the war, but we'll see. Thank you.